Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Ag Innovation News Podcast, presented by the Agricultural Utilization Research Institute of Minnesota. I'm Dan Scogan, your host for the Ag Innovation News Podcast. Guests on this podcast shed light on innovations and value-added agriculture, highlight important voices and work that's being done throughout the Minnesota ag sector, and educate the public about resources and organizations that support Minnesota agriculture. Today, we welcome to the Ag Innovation News Podcast Mike Reiber and Kim Nesvig. Mike's the founder and CEO of Axiom. He also helps companies identify market insights that accelerate business growth. He and his team use insights, innovation, marketing automation, and content to grow sales and profits. Kim is AURI's project and resource manager whose passion centers on building rural communities through agricultural innovations. Mr. Nesvig coordinates AURI's role as a technical assistance provider for the USDA's Agricultural Marketing Service, or AMS, the cooperative agreement that supports its meat and poultry processing capacity technical assistance program, and he is the first point of contact with potential applicants to AMS's grant programs. He also coordinates and provides technical assistance. Kim has a strong foundation with 40 years of experience in community development and regional planning, working with metropolitan and rural planning entities, state government, nonprofit healthcare, and academic institutions. And he has a wide-ranging experience serving communities and organizations in the upper Midwest and in Texas. Both of my guests worked recently and helped to release a report on cold storage for meat producers and processors. And today we're going to discuss what that report says, and we're going to talk about what actions might be taken to strengthen the meat processing industry in the Midwest. Kim, I'm going to start with you, and then we'll go to Mike on just some additional bio information. Tell us a little bit about your work history and your work at AURI.
If I go way back, my postgraduate school first employment was with North Central Planning Council in Devils Lake, North Dakota, where I worked on rural economic development, including development of a pasta plant in Candu, North Dakota. Subsequent projects range from the Durham Growers Processing Plant in Carrington and the Bison Co-op. I also worked with the North Dakota Association of Rural Electric Cooperatives as a cooperative development specialist during the 90s. And in between those, I spent some years at the School of Medicine doing rural leadership development in both North and South Dakota. Since that time, I've been involved in a number of business development ventures, including cooperative bean processing endeavor in Mayville, Portland, and a few other smaller ventures along the way. Plus, I was the CEO of some health centers in Texas for a while. So kind of a jack of all trades and master of none.
And Mike Reiber, how about yourself, your work history and a little bit about your path to Axiom?
Started Axiom in 1993, and our idea was there's a better way to understand commercialization and market needs. So we've had the privilege of working with AURI for the past 10 years. What we help AURI do is understand market dynamics that impact the success of the new products and new systems that AURI develops. So what that means is I spend an awful lot of time looking at statistics and figures. I also spend a lot of time talking to consumers and influencers who impact the success of these value-added commodity products that AURI develops.
And I'm going to come back to you, Kim, because today we're going to talk about this assessment or depth interview that was done, which resulted in the release of a study report on the 5 state areas cold storage assessment. First of all, why would we need to do that? And why did AURI get involved in something like that? How did that come to pass?
Back in 2021, you'll all recall the turmoil in the meat processing industry as a result of the COVID pandemic. Many processors, large processors, were forced to close their plants or slow down production, and that in turn affected livestock producers who in some cases had to destroy animals that couldn't be brought to process market at the time, and soon, especially with hogs, were too large to be processed efficiently. The terrible loss there for them, and it also threatened the supply of meats on the grocery shelves. So fortunately, some of that shortfall during the midst of the pandemic was filled by small processors, and that was critical in maintaining the nation's meat supply. Since then, the USDA has sought to address some of the vulnerabilities they see in the meat processing industry, both the concentration within the industry and also the difficulties of small processors in being competitive in supplying products to the larger market. In particular, USDA has offered a number of grant initiatives to help small processors finance modernization and expansion. But alongside these investments, USDA Ag Marketing Service that you mentioned earlier sought to engage small meat processors and other stakeholders to identify ways that they might strengthen the meat industry. The result was a cooperative agreement between AMS and AURI. This was entitled Empowering Local and Regional Meat Processing in the Upper Midwest. It was envisioned, among other things, as being a pilot project or a demonstration that might be applied in other parts of the country as well. Under the cooperative agreement, we convened a couple of advisor groups, including stakeholders such as meat processors, regulatory agencies, academics, finance institutions, and development organizations, looking at things that were both challenges and opportunities relating to the viability of meat processors in the Upper Midwest. Access to cold storage facilities was widely perceived as one such obstacle and also a potential opportunity to strengthen the industry. I think it was mid-2023, we put out a request for proposals, perhaps a little earlier than that sought to explore more deeply the subject matter, and Axiom won that competition, was selected to conduct what amounts to a deeper dive into the geographic availability, suitability, and cost of existing facilities, and both the need and the interest for new cold storage options.
Kim, do you think AURI was looking for information or USDA, or was it a little bit of both?
Really, it was a bit of both. Primarily, we took the lead from our advisory groups. They saw a need and perceived a need, at least. And of course, we had to go back to USDA and get their approval to proceed with a competitive request for proposals. So there was buy-in from all levels.
And Mike, of course, Axiom went out and did the work, and you promised if we ask, you can spout off all kinds of statistics. But let's just start with the 30,000-foot view. What's the state of cold storage in the Upper Midwest?
It's not a rosy picture. We talk about food deserts. I could say there's a cold storage desert in the 5 Upper Midwest states. What that means is that in the metropolitan areas, you've got some cold storage where you can transfer frozen meats and keep them in place so that they can then be distributed. But as you get north and west and sometimes east of the metropolitan areas, there are no large storage facilities available. Most of the cold storage facilities that are even in the metro areas are full. They're full. And so you have that dynamic as well. The other thing that is happening is that half of the cold storage facilities were constructed, or 3/4 actually, were constructed before the year 2000. And what that means is that they're all 25 years old and they haven't kept up with the growth and need for refrigerated and frozen foods. Now, that's not true in the Southeast and the Southwest, where population is growing. There's lots more cold storage in those areas of the country, but there just isn't a lot. Why is there not a lot? Because these facilities are very expensive to build and create and retrofit. And so what's happened is that food organizations like Schwann's or Johnny Pops, they have to look really carefully at the cost of building these facilities because they're very expensive to build. And their big concern is, will they remain full? And that's the question mark that holds back the development of and investment in these new cold storage facilities.
So it really comes down to economics, especially for the small and medium-sized processors or producers.
You're right exactly on the money there, Dan. We interviewed a number of small and independent meat cutters. And when I say small, these people, they're not your local butcher. They're much more than that. So we talked to a business in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. We talked to a business near Ames, Iowa, and these people are actually, multi-million-dollar businesses in and of themselves. But they see their model as quick in and quick out. They don't want to store meat for people. In the past, the butcher used to have a locker. Instead of having a freezer at your home, you go to the locker and pick up your meat. These people don't want to do that because they want the meat to come in and come out, because they also cannot afford to expand the footprints of their rendering facilities. And that's a very cogent point for them because that's also an expensive process that may require a new certification that they don't want to go through.
I would think that the consumer does not have a clue that this is part of the problem in the meat processing market, in that every time I go to the grocery store in the frozen foods, there's meat there every time. So the meat is being processed someplace. Where does it go, or how does it put pressure on the small and medium-sized producers?
What we saw in COVID, as many of you will remember, is that our distribution chain broke down, which meant that we couldn't render as much meat, we couldn't transport the meat, we couldn't keep it in the grocery stores. And that was because of all the COVID factors. This grant, as Kim mentioned, was intended to look at that situation and understand what could be done to prevent that from occurring in the future. And so, to your question, Dan, the problem is when there's interruptions to the cycle, because most of our food is delivered just in time, quick in and quick out. And when it gets disrupted, it's a problem. Another factor that played into this research that we looked at was the major meat renderers have consolidated. Instead of 10, there's 4 now. And when we have disruptions like we had in COVID, it's highly interrupted because we don't have any slack in the system anymore because they've all centralized. And if a meat plant is shut down, as happened during COVID, one meat plant could create a much larger ripple in this distribution situation that then creates shortages and increased meat prices.
So, Kim, I don't think you were surprised by this report, in that we sat in on some of the conversations with our stakeholders. And I think we were hearing this from just about everybody that participated in the early days of getting ready to do this report.
That's absolutely correct. We knew there would be issues out there, and we also knew that it was a challenge for the smaller processors. Small processor covers a lot of ground, as you know. In USDA's view, a small processor can have less than 500 employees. Many of our shops are mom and pop operations with few or no other employees. And they simply don't have the capital resources, and in some cases, the expertise to develop and even to analyze the feasibility of developing their own cold storage capability. And their market is a little different too, because barring the opportunity to provide to fill a void created when one of the big 3 processors goes down, they're really marketing to a local market. Right now, a lot of our smaller processors are seeing ranchers and farmers in that area bypass the local plant and go on to the auction because livestock prices are pretty good and the supply is short.
I want to talk a little bit about what this report says about opportunities, but I want to remind our listeners that you're listening to the Ag Innovation News podcast. And today we're talking about cold storage for meat processors and the producers in the upper Midwest. It comes from a report that was done by Axiom for AURI. We're visiting with Mike Reiber and Kim Nesvig. Mike is the CEO of Axiom, and Kim works with AURI in coordinating AURI's role as a technical assistance provider. So out of these kinds of problems come some opportunities. Mike, when you think about opportunities that may have been uncovered during this study or this interview, what did you see that maybe the entrepreneur should be thinking about?
One of the things that we see and have seen since 2020 is a big increase investor interest in funding these types of cold storage facilities. Why is that? Well, first of all, we've got organizations like Amazon who are delivering groceries and Walmart, and there's greater need than ever for these types of cold storage facilities. But Amazon and Walmart and even Schwann's here in Minnesota, they don't necessarily want to manage those facilities. They may want to invest partially in the facilities. So that's where these investors are coming in. And Johnny Pops created, with the help of AURI 3 years ago, a cold storage facility that is located in Albert Lea. And it's been so successful that they're now talking about expanding it. Why has it been successful? Well, if you build it, people will come, right? And they have come to that area. It's located in a easy access to major roads and interstates, south, north, east, and west. So these types of contract cold storage facilities, many are being built in the southeast and the mid-Atlantic coast. In fact, there's just a ton of them in Texas. And investors are reaping the benefits. The other play here is that there are cold storage logistics folks who specialize in this, and they are helping food companies, large and small, control their cold storage costs through effective management of these facilities.
So who manages them then if the big companies don't really want to be the managers?
Third-party experts manage them, and there are 10 large ones that are around the country that are, some of them are actually publicly traded companies, and that's their business is cold storage. They do it better than anybody else. Schwann's just is creating a new facility in Iowa. I believe it's north of Ames and a little east. And what they're doing with that particular facility is they funded the building and expansion of it, but then they've outsourced the management of it to the cold storage experts. That's a model that the individual that we spoke with really thinks is a positive model for the future.
So in the areas of the United States where cold storage is being built and managed, are those states offering some incentives? Is the federal government leaning in to those areas of the country, or why are these facilities going up everywhere except the Midwest?
I can't speak to the incentive structures of the Western states. We only look at the 5-state Midwest area. And right now, there are limited incentives from the federal and state governments. There are also limited incentives from the electricity providers for those areas. But let me give you a snapshot of facility stats. So this is according to USDA's cold storage report. California has 177 total cold storage facilities with 611 million cubic feet. Minnesota has 34 cold storage facilities with 140 million cubic feet. So you can see the difference. And the difference is truly a factor of population base, because where you have growing population, and I mentioned that growing population is in the Sun Belt and the Southeast, that's where you have these types of facilities going up. The ones in Texas and in the Eastern Seaboard, Southeast, and around Atlanta, those are all privately funded facilities. And they're privately funded by investors and real estate investment trusts and organizations like that.
So they're expensive to build, but they can turn a profit, and investors just need to be educated on that?
They do turn a profit, and many of them turn a profit in the first 5 or 6 years. They have to, because that's what the investors are expecting. And in the state of Minnesota, there are a couple of really smart cold storage experts that have bundled incentives from the federal government, from the state government, and from local business development organizations for the counties and cities. And right now, one is probably in the process of being built right now up in St. Cloud. It was on the books a year ago when we did this research, and it sounded like it was getting fast-tracked. So what happens is these experts are pulling together all of the different incentives. They're pulling together people who could be potential users and rent that space. And then they're looking at it from an economic development perspective about how many jobs it will create. And these facilities do create jobs. There was a gentleman from South Dakota who is very successful. He's got a growing meat business. He's based in Wall, South Dakota. Well, guess what? There was such a shortage, and he was tired of paying higher than average rates for his cold storage in Rapid City, that he decided to build his own facility. And it's in excess of 200,000 square feet, and it will employ 50 additional people. Well, he's a smart businessman. He got some incentives from the state of South Dakota. He got some incentives from the USDA, and he built that, and it should be operational now in South Dakota. His vision, which is a really interesting vision, is to create outposts, smaller cold storage facilities that have a logistics truck that can go back and forth and transfer meat in a hub and spoke model. And again, he's highly successful, and he wants to make that open. that an open system, so some of the smaller mom and pop shops that Kim referred to previously can actually use that system and not have to create and expand their own refrigeration and cold storage models.
So, Kim, being the first point of contact with some potential applicants to the federal government's programs, are there some pretty good incentives from the Fed and from the state for somebody who might want to try to set something up?
I think the last round of what were called local meat capacity grants was a good indication of the scale that USDA is looking at. On the one hand, they had equipment-only grants that could go up to $250,000, which might be sufficient to do some renovations of existing cold storage facilities and some of these older plants. Those are still under review right now, and we hope to see about $30 million worth of additional investment announced in the next few months in that matter. Every year, USDA has value-added processing grants that are available that can be applied towards similar projects, and those can be typically grants that match 25 to 30% of the total cost of investment. So essentially take a part of the equity obligation away from the individual developer. In addition, many of the states can offer what's called rural economic development loan and grants through their rural electric cooperatives. Those can go up in the millions of dollars and are available at very, very low interest rates, so they can be quite an incentive. The other thing to bear in mind is that we are, as you know, Dan, the state's cooperative development center. And before we can necessarily get developers or groups of processors like Ken Shafaris that runs the River Meats in Walnut, South Dakota, before that kind of thing can really get launched, you need to do some underlying research into feasibility and business planning to develop not just the feasibility of a storage facility, but that logistic network of transportation, and I think also marketing to justify aggregating those frozen meat products, transporting them, and then redistributing them out of the hubs that were alluded to a little while ago. That's something that we can be involved in. And I think it plays into AURI's intended role of being a catalyst for rural and agriculturally related business development.
I'm going to pose a question as we get close to the end of our time together, but I'm going to start with you, Kim, and then I'll jump over to Mike for his thoughts. But is it feasible to think about this in a cooperative manner where we're bringing in more than one entity and they're sharing not only knowledge, but maybe some transportation costs, some of the other parts of running the business? Does that seem feasible?
I'll back away from saying feasibility, but I would say necessary in order to accomplish the task, because as I mentioned earlier, many of these smaller processors have their hands full of day-to-day operations. And I know in particular, one of them that I've worked with a great deal said, great ideas, but I don't have the time to do this. It doesn't have the expertise, doesn't have the time. He's got to take care of his day-to-day business. That's where we can step in and help create a cooperative structure that can take on that responsibility for development. I know in talking with Mike earlier, really someone to play that developer's role is essential in getting projects like these off the ground. It's not so hard in a major metropolitan area where you have folks that recognize the market opportunity and they're used to working there, but getting out into northern Minnesota or the frontier areas of North and South Dakota is a bigger challenge.
Mike, how about you? Does Axiom feel there's some room for some cooperation or some cooperative pulling together?
Absolutely. And the way that it can happen is it can happen on a regional basis within 60 to 90-mile radius, because the economic development officials in those areas are trying to resolve how they can enable the businesses to grow faster. As I mentioned before, if you build it, they will come. The challenge is getting to the discussion where it's becoming a reality that it could be built. And that's a function of jobs. That's a function of revenue. That's a function of need based on the area. Michael Stitsworth in the state of Minnesota, very, very successful meat packer, and especially meat packer. He doesn't have enough cold storage in northern Minnesota. It's stopping his production process. Could be producing lots and lots more sausage and things that he's good at producing, but he's prevented by his ability to get the meat frozen and get the meat out of cold storage and onto his customers. And it's also exacerbated by the bottlenecks that happen seasonally. So we've got major bottlenecks, beginning of barbecue season. beginning of hunting or end of hunting season, holidays, when people are using these meat products. And that's where the opportunity lies for people like Michael Stitsworth at Stitsworth Meats or Ken from Wall Meats in South Dakota. And they're looking very carefully at that. And they're working collaboratively with city, county entities and organizations like AURI to solve the problems.
Kim, USDA, how did they react to this? Have they given you much of a reaction to what this interview uncovered?
USDA was really excited about the variety of different deliverables that were created under this cooperative agreement and anxious to have it distributed nationally so that it can help inform the discussion, not just in our upper Midwest area, but elsewhere. And we continue to have conversations with AMS about how we might be able to act upon and leverage some of the prior research we've done to result in direct benefits to the industry and really to our economic community as a whole.
Mike, you were involved heavily in getting through the process. What do you want to leave our listeners with today?
I want to leave our listeners with a couple of facts. First of all, just because there's less population in the north of Minnesota or in the frontier areas of the Dakotas doesn't mean that there's not economic opportunity for these cold storage structures. There is. Secondly, the consumer demand for frozen and not only meat products, but frozen vegetable products and fruit products is high. Why? Because consumers want unprocessed food that is frozen and can be thawed and fresh. And that's going to go nowhere but up as people eat healthier. Therein lies the opportunity for not only the cold storage frozen facilities, but also cold storage fresh facilities that are refrigeration facilities. And there's some very interesting studies that USDA has done on that, as well as private research groups that talk about freshness and its importance to the American consumer.
And Kim, as the voice of AURI on this particular podcast, if we piqued somebody's mind a little bit and they want more information and they want to follow up, take a look at the study or the interview, where can they find all that?
All of the outcomes from this, the documents, both summary documents and detailed reports, are available at AURI's website. So if someone is interested in accessing copies of the reports and getting background on individual projects, you'll find them at auri.org. Go to the bottom of the landing page, the main page, and look for the tile called Meat Endeavors. Click on that and it'll bring you to a complete discussion of this particular cooperative agreement with AURI. It'll also give you, if you take the time, you can go through and learn more about what AURI is doing in the meat environment, the resources that we have in-house that can be of value to processors and to local and regional economic developers.
Kim Nesvig and Mike Reiber, thanks so much for your time. It was a great conversation.
Enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you.
We've been visiting today with Mike Reiber. He is the CEO of Axiom, and Kim Nesvig from AURI. I want to thank you for joining us today and for listening to the Ag Innovation News Podcast presented by the Agricultural Utilization Research Institute of Minnesota. I want to thank my podcast crew, Lisa Martinez, AURI Communications Manager and the editor of this production. As Kim mentioned, to learn more about any of the work that AURI is working on, you can go to auri.org.